Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and to this highly requested preview of my bear tutorial, which is available over on Patreon. So this is just a preview. It's about an hour long, but the full tutorial itself is real time and it has a voiceover, covers all the steps, has a material list, and it is about 7 hours in length. Like all of my lessons, I do like to start with either the eyes or the nose. And those of you who have listened to a couple of my other previews, you'll know the reason for doing this is because I find that the eyes and the nose are often the most important part of an animal, and especially the eyes hold the most character. So if you do get them wrong, then it's quite a big issue and it does change the whole look of the portrait. So I find if I get them in at the start and I make a mistake, then it's not such a stress for me because I haven't spent hours and hours on loads of the fur work. So I can just throw it away or try and start again on the same piece of paper and not worry about all of that lovely work that I've spent hours on beforehand. So if you're ever concerned about where to start, try and start with the eyes or the nose. This nose is a lovely shiny one. It's got lots of cool hints to it, as you can see in the photograph. So I'm getting hints of blues in, and I've got some purple in as well. The blues I use are from Faber-Castell. I use the cobalt blue and sometimes the light ultramarine, which is a bit more of a baby blue. So I've got a couple of hints in there. And then I'm just kind of layering up now, really making sure this nose is nice and dark and nice and thick so that we're covering up that paper underneath. And then only then, once the base is nice and thick, I can go in and start adding some details in. So with this cold grey 4 from Stabilo, which is number 726, I'm working these little marks in, and what they're going to do is start to form those little bumps that you can see on noses. You get them with most animals. And then what I'm doing here is just starting to gradually lift with a couple of lighter grey tones. Obviously in the full length tutorial, I'll take you through all the tones step by step, real time. So there's no skipping that we've got in this preview, obviously. And everything's really detailed. I had a comment recently on one of my previews to say they're confused about why I haven't talked through the light placement on the subject that I was doing the preview of. It's because all of that is in the full length tutorial. I take you through a couple of tips and tricks in my previews, but I tend to obviously keep most of my suggestions and advice, etc., in my full length tutorials, and there's plenty of them in the backlog. There's over 3.5 years worth now to get through. So there's all kinds of subjects. You've got birds, dogs, cats, horses, lots of different wildlife. So we've obviously got this bear, we've got a bobcat coming next month, cheetahs, lions, I mean, you name it. I'm starting to really struggle thinking of new animals, but there's always different poses that you can do and different light hitting the animals, etc. So still plenty on my list to get through. Now, the reason why I wanted to pull together this particular tutorial is because of this bear's fur. You'll see it's quite damp, it's wet in sections, so I basically wanted to pull together something that wasn't fluffy. A lot of my tutorials, obviously the fur is dry. This one we're working on slightly trickier fur. It's a different process. The base in terms of the colors is actually the same as you would use for your dry subjects, but in terms of the actual technique of working the hairs in and forming the base sort of shape, it is slightly different. So I'll cover a little bit about how I do that in this preview. But for now, I'm just starting to build up those different tones that I can see in the base. So we've got plenty of brown in this section here. I'm using a variety of my Unison soft pastels. I appreciate not everyone can access Unison or perhaps find them a little bit too expensive. There are other soft pastel brands available, and I do try and provide alternatives if you ask. So just drop me a message and say, oh, I use Smink only, and then I can try and match the different colors and see what works best for each tutorial. So I'm starting to just lift the fur a little bit here with a couple of different light beige tones. It's a fine balance with this base because we've got a lot of dark skin showing through underneath. Because the fur is a little bit wet, it tends to clump together and you've got these gaps going on, which you obviously want to mimic. So although you do want to get a little bit of a light base in there so that it's not too difficult to lift your fur later on with your hair details, you do want to make sure that there is an element of darkness there as well. You'll see I'm picking out a few of the darkest sections, leaving most of it quite light, but just where I can see in the photograph there's patches of dark going on, I'm making sure I'm getting those in there just with a light layer of dark tone. The danger is starting off a little bit too dark in a lighter section and then you will struggle to lift later on. So I'm just being quite cautious as I lift up. It's always better with your base layers to lift gradually, or well, layer gradually. So lots of thin layers as opposed to one thick layer, which means you're going to just saturate the paper straight away, and then there's less opportunity for you to add lots of different additional tones in there. So you'll see here, I'm just very, very gently lifting with very thin layers, and I'm trying to pull out in the direction that the fur is taking. So instead of flatly blending and flatly applying the base, once I get to the second base stage, so once I've got the first initial layer down and I'm starting to thicken up the base, I want to make sure I work it in the direction, and that starts to build up texture in the fur and it gives it lots of dynamic movement, which is important for this bear. We want to show all of the lovely bone structure and muscle structure going on. So onto the eye, just working a little bit of that shine around the eyelid. That helps to make the eye itself look nice and three-dimensional. And then I'm just working a little bit of brown into the eye ball itself. So just around the iris there. Although it is a tiny eye, especially in relation to the head, we want to still make sure we get a few different tones in there, and obviously plenty of detailing to make sure we bring it to life. You don't want to skimp on the details with a eye like this, even if it is small. So adding a little bit of blue like I did with the nose just into the eyelid to make it look nice and shiny. So just a little bit of my cobalt blue from Faber-Castell, and then I'm just working a couple of highlights in here just on top of that base that I've created. So that just helps to bring it to life nicely. As I mentioned, it is a small eye, but I'm still trying to work in a little bit of specks of light on the inner eyelid there, and that's just helping to really bring this to life. So a bit more light around the front here, and then I'm starting to work a little bit more base in between the eyes here. So lots of rich tones for this bear because he's a lovely, vibrant colour. He's got lots of these different tones going on in his fur. Once the base is complete and you're happy with it, you can then start to add in your hair details. I always prefer to work dark up to light like I do with my base. It just makes the fur look like it's got so much more depth and density. So I'm just using a normal black. This is my Stabilo Black 750 just to start to work a very thin layer of these hairs in. You'll see they're very feather light. I'm not pressing too hard. I don't want them to come out too thick. I always say with fur, if it's looking thick, the fur in the photograph, then it's got lots and lots of layers, which means you need to add equally as many layers in with your actual art. So the more hair layers you add in, the thicker your fur is naturally going to look. Now, if you're adding these hair layers in really thickly, so each individual hair is really fat, what's going to happen is you're going to fill the area a lot quicker. There's going to be less gaps. So if you make the hairs a lot thinner, then you can fit more in, and that's obviously going to make the fur look a lot thicker. So this is what we're aiming for, and how you can achieve this is by pressing really lightly. And it's one of the things that's really transformed my work over the years. When I first started off in pastels, I was just pressing too hard, and not just with my hair layers with my base layers as well, and I was really saturating the paper. But it's so key with these hairs to add them in nice and thin, because you also get a lot of movement in as well. If you're controlling the pencil quite a lot by pressing hard down onto the paper, it's going to make the hairs come out a lot stiffer, so they're going to be more controlled, which is a little bit confusing because I'm sure most of you would assume that you'd need control when you're working with a pastel pencil or any pencil. But actually, the less control you have, so the less pressure you put on the pencil, and the more fluid and free your hand is, so more flexible, looser, the more fluid the hairs will come out. And even though you are pressing very lightly, you do still have a slight element of control. It's not completely out of control, the pastel pencil, but it just means that the hairs come out with a lot more curve to them, and they just come out nice and dainty as well, and not too thick and too harsh either. So I would recommend that way of working. You can always try and practice on a spare piece of paper, different pressures, try and press a little bit harder if you want the maybe the eyeball to look a little bit darker. So I'm not saying don't ever work really hard in pressure, but for your hair layers, I would recommend going a little bit lighter. But obviously, if you're colouring in a nostril or an eyeball, or it's a really dark area, then you can press nice and hard. Just like the base, I'm using lots of different tones to make up the fur as well. That just ensures that the fur does look nice and realistic. It's not just one or two tones. There's lots going on in the photograph, so I'm making sure I get a variety in there. And I always soften as I go with my finger. It just helps to get rid of any grittiness, which you do sometimes get with pastels. I personally like my work to look nice and seamless. So tapping as I go along, just on top of those lines and hairs, it does tend to help to smooth everything really nicely and give that nice soft effect in the fur. So I'm using this lovely vibrant tone. It's a burnt sienna from Faber-Castell 283, particularly in this area here. It's lovely, and it's got a nice kind of red base brown to it. And then just working a little bit of medium yellow tone in as well. As I say, lots of different tones going into the fur. We've got red base browns, we've got yellows, we'll have some oranges as well, and some darker tones like this dark sepia from Faber-Castell 175. This is always good for those darker areas which need some hair detailing, but you don't want to go too light. You just want to build up a first initial layer, and then you can always add a little bit of shine on top with a lighter grey tone just to lift it slightly. So this is my grey 3 from Stabilo 704 that I'm using. So this is nice and warm in tone. There's plenty of warmth going on in the spare. I've added a couple of cold hints in, especially around the nose where you can see some blue hints, and just around the mouth as well. But as a whole, it is mainly warm. Again, softening as I go to get rid of grittiness. You'll see this initial base layer of hairs is starting to really form now. It's starting to make a lot of sense, but I'm not lifting just yet with anything like a white. I'm just gradually lifting. So carrying on with my grey 3 from Stabilo. This is a lovely light grey tone. It's got warm hints to it. And it's just going to start to bulk out our light area without lifting too much. If you go straight in with a really light tone like a white for this section here, what's going to happen is the fur is going to look really thin, because you've just gone straight away with a light tone and you can't really go anywhere from there, and it's always hard to darken on top of light. So you just want to start to build up nice and gradually. And obviously if you do start off a little bit darker, you get a couple of tones in there that aren't quite as bright as a white. Get a few layers of those in before you then add a white. The fur's then going to look nice and thick because you've not just got the one layer of white in there, you've got lots underneath to make sure the fur is nice and dense. So this is a cold grey I'm using here, a cold grey 2 from Stabilo. So hints around the mouth here where it is slightly cooler. And then as we move up the top here, switching to a warmer grey tone. So this is just getting those slight subtle changes in there between cool and warm. They're not really dramatic, so I'm not using really obviously cold tones and really obviously warm tones. with my lessons, I always use a mix of different pastel brands. I use Faber-Castell, Stabilo, and a few Caran d'Ache, not heaps. But as I've mentioned before, if you do need help picking out alternative tones, if perhaps you don't have Faber-Castell or Stabilo, then I can help you out. You just need to drop me a message. But the reason I use different brands and not just one is because I like to have as wide a range of tones as possible. The Stabilo range, I would say, has the most tones. It's got a brilliant range. And it's very affordable. However, there are tones from the Faber-Castell range and the Caran d'Ache range which I just can't live without. And the key to realistic artwork is getting as many tones into your fur as possible, which is possible with just the one brand, but it will look a little bit more flat than if you were to use multiple different brands, I personally would find. And some tones are really unique. So this grey 3 from Stabilo, you'll struggle to find it in the other brands. And there's also differences like the burnt sienna from Stabilo. It's more red based and it really packs a punch. So if you do want to just get a real pop of vibrancy into any areas of fur which are this kind of red based brown tone, it's fantastic. Whereas the burnt sienna from Faber-Castell, I do use a lot more because it's slightly less vibrant, so it's a bit more natural, so it's perfect for your eyes and the area underneath the eye where it's nice and brown. However, it's just not quite as punchy as that Stabilo one. So if you just wanted something extra, then the Stabilo one is perfect. And sometimes I just find that the burnt sienna from Faber-Castell isn't quite enough for certain sections or certain areas. So it's just really helpful to have that extra really nice red tone in your collection. And the same also applies for the Bista from Faber-Castell. Now this is more of a yellow, medium yellow tone, which I use so much. It's fantastic. But then the Bista, spelled slightly different, ER as opposed to RE, from Stabilo 635 is one of my darkest browns. And again, this one I use so much, I can't live without it. And it's quite difficult to find that same depth in the Faber-Castell range of browns. I've struggled to find something that is that little bit darker. I often mix my black. Well, before I discovered the Stabilo Bista, I had to mix my black with my darkest brown from the Faber-Castell range, which is the burnt umber 280, but that's a little bit more yellow based, whereas the Bista from Stabilo is a slightly different tone. So again, you've got another dark brown tone in your collection, which is on top of that burnt umber. Using both will add two different dark brown tones into fur, which will again bring your fur to life so much more, having lots of different tones in there. So with these damp tufts and wet tufts, the key is to start to clump them together. So they're not so clumped up the top of the nose area. It's quite short fur there, but as we move around the eye and once I get onto the forehead on the cheek, the fur gets a lot longer, which means it takes a lot longer to dry. So the fur is very stuck together, and we basically need to form these by pulling loads of hairs close together, almost stuck together, and that will form these damp clumps going on. So it's not so obvious in this section around the mouth and around the nose. As I say, the fur here is a little bit shorter, but you'll notice that my hairs are a little bit more stuck together than I would normally apply them with dry fur if you've watched my other previews. So I'm just starting to work some dark hair details in as well, just on top of where the slightly darker base sits, where the darker skin is peeking through. I always add these dark hair details in as I layer up and lift the fur, and it just ensures that the depth still remains and there's plenty of detailing in there. Dark hair details are just as important, I say, than the light hair details. Not forgetting the little chin here. It's quite dark, so I'm working quite a lot of dark base to start off with. So just a bit of my dark sepia from Faber-Castell, and then starting to work some more light hairs in with my titanium white from Stabilo 100. So just picking around the lip here, picking out some of these slightly random little short whisker hairs going on. I'll just explain my tiers as well while I've got you here. So I get a few people asking what's the difference between my tiers over on Patreon. So the focus tier, which is the most affordable tier, it's only £5 a month. That's mainly for people who are either just starting out on in pastels, or they've taken a long break, they're trying to come back to it, or they're just sort of wanting to take it back to basics. So the focus tier, it's just sections of animals. It's not full length tutorials, so from start to finish of an animal. It will be things like sections of white fur, how to do curly fur, backgrounds, lots of different subjects, nose areas, noses, eyes, fluffy ears, stripy fur, spots on fur, so things like that, different techniques. And there's lots of tips as well in terms of ways to sharpen your pastel pencils, how to keep your work clean as well, what I use to protect my artwork as well once I've finished. So there's heaps and heaps and heaps on there, which you can actually view all of these lessons in my collections tab on Patreon or on my website. There's a tutorial library, so you can just scroll through and see what takes your fancy. Then if you upgrade, you've got the full animal and backlog tier. So this, as the name suggests, is full length animals from start to finish. These tutorials are normally plus 6 hours in length. A lot of them are quite a bit longer. The focus tier ones, they can range anything from half an hour to an hour to nearly 2 hours. So yes, the tier up, if you join that, there's quite a lot to get through with that. And again, I've got a huge backlog of full length animals to get through. And these lessons, some of them can be quite challenging, but who doesn't love a challenge? Anyone can do them. So even if you are a beginner, you don't have to join the focus tier. You can go straight in. I've had absolute beginners join that middle tier, and they've done absolutely brilliantly. Even if you've got no skill at all, pastel's such an easy medium to learn, I find. And once you really nail the different processes like the base stage, it's really easy, I find, to just continue really elevating your work. And it's obviously a lot quicker than colour pencils. If any of you use colour pencils and want to make the switch, that's the real benefit of pastels compared to colour pencils. I know they're a lot messier, but they really speed you through your work. And then if you go one tier up from that, that's the VIP pastel tier. This is, you get everything in the tiers below. So also I should mention the full animal and backlog tier, that also you get the focus tier pastel. So anything higher, you get everything beneath as well. So the VIP pastel, everything underneath, and you also get a critique every month. So you send me an artwork, whether that's finished or just a work in progress. It doesn't have to be a tutorial. If it's a commission or just a personal piece you're working on, pop it to me via email and just say what your concerns are, or you just generally want me to critique it, and I'll take a look and let you know my thoughts, if there's anything you need to correct, or if you just want to elevate it, if there's any suggestions to make it more realistic, etc. So that's the VIP tier. And then one up from that is the pastel and acrylic tier. So that's a duo pack. I work in acrylic as well, not that often, and I did start off with acrylics when I started my Patreon channel. So there's a little backlog available for acrylics. So if you did want to learn acrylic for a little bit on top of pastel, you can join that duo pack. So it just means you don't have to dip into the separate acrylic tier and then jump back to the pastel tier. It's kind of all in one place for you. You'll see as I blend this layer of light pastel out, I'm working it in the direction that I applied it. So we're starting to now form these damp tufts. You'll make your life a lot easier if you try and form the clumps at the base stage. I always call this stage the shaping stage. The base should always start to form the third direction, and if there's any bone structure or muscle structure going on, you need to get all of that in at the base stage, which means you then don't have to stress so much about your hair details. And you, with bone structure and muscle structure, you want to make sure you're working your hairs around specific shapes. So if you haven't got that in at the base stage, then it's going to be an absolute nightmare when you're working your hairs in, because you're going to have to try and form that shape then and there, and it's not going to look natural at all. So you'll see here I've started to form those tufts very, very roughly. It's not about getting every single one exactly as it is in the photograph, it's just getting the general direction going in there, and if there are any really obvious clumps sticking out of these tufts, then obviously add those in, but just try and roughly get them in the direction that they're going in. So I've just added a few dark hair details around them just to pick them out a little bit more. Just adding another layer of light pigments to lift as well, just to make sure that it's nice and light so that I don't struggle to lift it with my hair details later on. So a good blend with my sponge here. So lots of layers going in here. I'm not working any details until the base is looking nice and thick, and we've got some more of these tufts formed. I've added a little bit of a vibrant orangey red tone in there just to give a little bit more color in this middle section here. There's a little bit of dryness going on with the fur in the center there. It's not quite as clumped as the areas around, so the hairs are a little bit more fluffy. So you can see a little bit more brown showing through and less of that really dark skin. So I've just added a little bit more vibrancy in there, and then I'm going around with my Cretacolor, just starting to pick out these tufts even more. You can make them look nice and three-dimensional, like they're sticking out, by giving them a little bit of an outline. I always go around with a black like this and just pick around the edges nicely. So still softening as I go, as I layer up, making sure everything's nice and soft and smooth and seamless. Continuing to add in my dark details here, just really defining at this stage. Starting to thicken up the ear, even though this ear is very small, especially compared to the one on the right. We still need to pack just as much details and hairs in there for it to look the same thickness in terms of the fur layers. Like the fur on the forehead, I'm not lifting straight away with a white. I'm getting slightly more natural tones in there that have colour to them, just to make sure we're not lifting too much too soon. We don't want the bear to look really old and really white. Always making sure I keep packing in my vibrant tones right until the end with the layering process. So plenty of my burnt umber from Faber-Castell 187. There's lots of the rich red and orange tone going on in the ear here. So plenty of these different tones to pack in, including the burnt sienna from Faber-Castell 283, one of my favorites, just to get a real punch in there of color. And then I can finally start to lift with my really light tones. So a little bit of grey one from Stabilo 700, and then I can finish off with a layer of my titanium white from Stabilo 100. I'm going to start to lift my tufts now and start to really form them. We don't want to go bright just yet, so I'm starting off with a lovely mid-tone. This is a dark flesh 50% from Caran d'Ache. So I'm just beginning to work some nice little long hairs out, and we're going to condense them quite close together to form the tufts, to clump them together. So some slightly shorter ones above the eye here. We're leaving plenty of gaps in the base, and that just ensures that the fur does look like it is clumped together, and there's lots of these different gaps going on where we can see the darker skin and base showing through. You can see it's really starting to come together now. The reason I use a mid-tone for the first layer of kind of light hairs is because you want something that is not so dark that it's going to be really hard to then lift on top. So when you add lighter tones on top, they're just not going to lift at all because they've got all of that dark tone contaminating them underneath. Equally, you don't want something that's too light just yet, because then you're going to lose a lot of colour. It's going to look very washed out. And as I've said before, it's really hard to darken up areas after you've lightened them. So it's always better to start off with a mid-tone like this. So something that's in the middle of dark and light. You'll see for this first initial layer of medium hairs, I'm not condensing super close together. I'm forming the clumps quite nicely, but I'm not packing them really close together just yet. We want to just make sure we're seeing plenty of base showing through underneath. And then what I can do is just start to lift my fur. So I'm using a light flesh tint from Stabilo 681 for this. It's a nice light pink tone, and I'm just working it in those really light areas. And the reason why I'm adding pink into the fur is because when you've got vibrant fur like this, which has red base browns and yellow tones, there's always a danger that it's going to look too vibrant and a little bit unnatural. So I do find pinks just tone down the vibrancy. They just make it a little bit more balanced. So, I mean, you do want the fur to generally be vibrant, but if you use too much of yellows and red based browns, it can look a little bit too fiery. and, as I say, a bit unnatural. So using a pink will just soften everything and just even that balance out. It's a good idea as you layer up to keep adding your dark hair details in as well. So I'll be going around the whole of the head here and just defining these tufts nicely. So it's coming together now. I've added a few different tones in, just adding a little bit of grey in just for some slight shine on the fur. So as this is just a preview, there's quite a lot of tones I've skipped, quite a few stages as well. So this isn't the full thing. I'm not taking you step by step. So when I jump onto the next slide, you'll see there's quite a big difference normally between the last slide and the next slide. So that's because I've just cut out a few sections, a few stages. Obviously, all of that is included in the full length one. I just can't obviously give everything away in my previews, but this is just a little taste of what you'll be getting. And you can see the footage, obviously hear my voice and roughly what I'll be talking about and some of the tips and tricks as well. The other thing that I should mention with my tutorials is you can cancel anytime. It is a subscription service on Patreon. It's very affordable though. So if you just want to join for 1 month, if you're after just 3 or 4 particular tutorials, you don't want to go through my whole backlog, then you can obviously just quit after a month, but it's rolling, so you can just stay for as long as you want. Equally, if you don't want to be part of a subscription or sign up to anything, even though there's no contract, you just don't like subscriptions, you can buy my tutorials as just one-offs with no subscription. So how you can do that, I haven't actually got a shop on my website, so you just need to drop me an email. I'll put my email address below, or via my contact form on my website. Just let me know which tutorial you are after, or if you are after a couple, I'll let you know the price. It is slightly more expensive than if you were to join the subscription service, just because it's a little bit more admin for me. I have to compile everything together in an email for you and send it over. Yeah, I'll send all the links over to the videos, the material list, the outline, the reference photo, and my artwork as well to have a look at. And then that's yours to just take away and have forever. The link doesn't expire. So yes, just drop me a message if you would like to do that. If you want to know what tutorials are available, you can just visit my website, go to the tutorials tab, and there's the full list there. Or if you go to Patreon, if you go to the collections tab, you should be able to see, even if you're not a member, the list of all the lessons I have. So yes, just let me know and I will get back to you. The other thing I should mention, when you join up, you can also access my Facebook group. This is private normally, but obviously once you join Patreon, then you can join my Facebook group, which is a community of everyone that's joined. You don't have to post, it's not compulsory. Also, you don't have to join. Again, that's not compulsory either. But if you do join and you don't want to post, you can just see what everyone else is up to. People post their work in progress on tutorials and just general work. So any pet portraits they're doing, any personal projects, and everyone just kind of joins in and comments and encourages. And you can ask questions as well if you want advice from other artists on, for example, how they sharpen their pastel pencils if you don't particularly like the method that I use. It's just a really nice community to be part of. It's not really overwhelming, as in, if you join, you're not going to be bombarded with loads of notifications. People are very respectful. No one's overbearing, no one's posting loads. So yeah, it's definitely one to consider if you do join. It's not a scary place, and there's definitely no trolls or anything. It's all regulated. I do make sure I check everyone who joins. I know it is very scary putting yourself out there on social media. When I first joined social media, it wasn't so much of a big scary place, and there definitely weren't any trolls around at the time. When I started my Instagram page, it was very much, Instagram was kind of a new thing. It's definitely not how it is at the moment, which is just an absolute giant, and there's all these algorithms and all of these reels. It's can be quite a scary place, and I know a lot of people are put off by it. And that's another thing, actually, if you ever want advice on posting your work online, what things to try. It's quite daunting when you're first starting out, and it can be quite disheartening to try and get engagement. The one thing I would say, though, although the algorithm is an absolute nuisance and photographs are now being slightly hidden, you've got to create these reels and videos. If you create an engaging reel, and I'm not talking a big lengthy one, it can just literally be you holding your painting up, turning it around and showing everyone. As long as it's good quality, the lighting's good. I've seen artists and some of my patrons go from very little followers to viral overnight. So that's kind of the beauty of social media where we're at the moment. It's big and scary, but if you get it right and you get the algorithm on a good day, it can really work to your advantage. Back when I started on Instagram, there wasn't really that, you couldn't really go viral that easily. You couldn't upload reels, that wasn't a thing. So my following, I've organically grown over the last 6, 7, 8 years now. Maybe not quite 8 years, but everyone's always asking me, oh, how did you get the following you're at? What's the quick fix? Well, there isn't really. It's just uploading every other day, as much as you can, basically. But as I say, these days, you can, if you get it right, go viral very, very quickly. Anyway, back to the bear, you'll see I've completed his ear now, so I'm working on the tufty fur that's moving down the back of his neck into the cheek here. So it's a little bit darker. I've started off with quite a dark base, as you can see, and then we're going to start to lift from there. So just like the top of the head, I'm mixing quite a few different tones in. So oranges, red base browns. I've added in some of that dark flesh 50% as well, some of the pink, just to tone it down a little bit. So the fur in this area isn't quite as clumped together. It's starting to dry, so it's going a little bit fluffy, but it's quite unruly. So another reason why this is such a good tutorial, we've got different techniques going on, different styles of fur. We've got the wet fur up the top, and then it's starting to dry around the neck here. So I'm able to show you how to do this really unruly, scraggly fur that's super messy. So starting to pick out a few of the little highlights on the tips of the hairs here. So because they're quite raised and they're sticking out, we've got a lot of light hitting the ends, which I'm getting in. So down onto the cheek next, starting off with a nice dark base because of course this area is nice and deep and dark. As I've mentioned before, the soft pastels that I use are mainly unison for the colours because they are so rich and vibrant. And then I do use the Smink Serious Black, the Black D and the white. The reason being, I just find the unison black and white just not quite vibrant enough. When I say vibrant, it's obviously not got any colour, but I really want my blacks to look really nice and deep and dark, and then I want my whites to be as white as they can be. So I've just found that the Smink ones are generally better than other brands, so just via trial and error really. The Unison soft pastels, they come in so many different colors. I haven't really tried any other soft pastel brands like Pan Pastels or these Smink colors, mainly because it was the first set I was given Unison and I fell in love with it. And if you love what you use, then you don't tend to stray away from it. I wouldn't risk moving to another brand. I mean, I've got the colors that I want. They work really well for all the subjects that I do. So there's no point me going and spending any money on other brands, if that makes sense. However, as I've said before, if you do use another brand of soft pastel, which you love and you don't want to buy any Unison, then just drop me a message if you join my Patreon channel and I can help you match the tones. So my Unison ones I can match with obviously Smink or any other brands that you do use. Some of the tones are fairly unique, but I'll try and match them as best I can. Another question I get asked quite frequently is, can you do my tutorials with just pastel pencils? The answer is absolutely. Again, you just need to match the pastel pencil colors with the soft pastel tones that I use. Again, I can help you with this. The reason that I layer personally with soft pastels is they just make for quicker work. If you're trying to cover a section with your pastel pencils, it takes a lot longer. I also find the soft pastels, as the name implies, they're a lot softer. So you don't tend to condense the paper and damage the tooth as much as you would if you were trying to build up a heavy base with pastel pencils. Having said that, with my smaller works, I do tend to build up the base with the pastel pencils because the area is smaller. So you're able to work a little bit lighter in pressure. You're not having to layer as much, if that makes sense. If it was a bigger portrait, you're having to cover a lot more ground and a lot more paper. So it takes a lot more layers to cover all of that paper underneath. So if you are working tiny, then absolutely fine to use pastel pencils. And then if you don't have any soft pastels, then for the larger works, then obviously it is also fine. I can help you match those tones. But if you do have a little bit of spare money and you're thinking of investing in something art related, then I would really recommend the soft pastels. They're slightly more highly pigmented as well, I find, so perfect for building up a really nice vibrant base. And as I say, they're just so much quicker to work with. This section here I've completed in not very much time at all, whereas if I was working with my pastel pencils trying to fill it, it's just going to take probably about 4 times as long, which is not always ideal. Now, when you're blending your pastel pencils or your soft pastels, you can use any sponge. I love the pan pastel sponges that come with a little knife. They're perfect for those initial base blending stages where you really want to shift the pigment and push it into the paper. But most of you will notice as I get to the last few stages of my base blending, I start to use my hand, and that's just because what happens when you're blending with a sponge is, because it's such an efficient tool at blending, it tends to push the pigment quite a lot. So if you're really at those final stages, you want to maintain, if it's a really dark area, you want to maintain that depth, or it's a really vibrant area and you want to maintain that color, and you don't want to shift that pigment around too much. You've done all the soft blending, you've got it going into the paper, it's just about making the tone richer. Then the hand won't shift that pigment too much, it won't move it around too much, it's just getting rid of the excess and just pushing it into the paper ever so slightly. But it doesn't lighten your darker areas too much, and it doesn't darken your lighter areas up too much. Naturally, when you're blending with a sponge in those first initial stages, you'll find that when you're blending your light pastel, it tends to get a little bit darker just because you're pushing that pigment into the paper, you're thinning it out. And then with the dark pigment, it starts to get a little bit lighter because, again, you're spreading that pigment out quite a lot, so you're thinning it. So I hope that makes sense. As I say, try and use your hand a little bit towards those final stages. Just make sure it is clean. Obviously, any oils on your hands can impact the pigment, so just give those hands a wash and a soap before you do that. What else about blending? I also use a Q-tip, which otherwise known as an earbud, which may sound bizarre, but it's actually the perfect small tool for getting to nifty little areas, tricky areas, and any shaping you want to do. So in particular for these damp tufts, obviously I am working big, so the sponge was perfect. But if you're working smaller, then you can help to form them with something a bit smaller, like a earbud. And they are the most unusual but wonderful tool to use. I also recommend, if you have them, or they're very cheap to buy, the makeup, the eyeshadow little sponges. They're also very, very good to use for smaller areas. You'll see this darker area fur doesn't require as much light tones. We need to pick out a few of these lighter ends here, but we're not going as bright as the top of the head. So just whisking a few of these lighter hairs out with some greys, the dark flesh 50% as well. Just mixing a few different tones in there, making sure where we've got the really dark tone showing through in between the layers, we're making sure we're leaving gaps there. We're not applying too many hairs in that area. So starting to lift a couple more of these tips here with an even lighter tone. And then continuing to add vibrancy in right until the end. You must make sure you're building up these orange and red based tones in these areas here, particularly on the cheek and the back. You can see there's lots of this scruffy orange fur going on, so we just want to mimic that. And if you ever go a little bit too vibrant, obviously you can just tone it down with some pink. So down to the neck here, starting off nice and dark. This area generally is a little bit darker, so we can go quite overboard with the dark tone. And then it's quite light on the left, so I'll be mixing some light tones in there in a moment. So a few different tones mixed in here. These are the Unison soft pastels. The full list is on my Patreon channel, so I'll talk you through each one as I go. So just starting to bulk this up, a nice vibrant base underneath, because this area, although light, has a lot of nice vibrant colour to it, and always working in the direction that the fur is going in. So with the base all blended, I can start to work my details in, starting off very, very dark in this area because generally it is darker. So we don't want to go too bright just yet. We're starting to really bulk out the fur, make it look nice and thick with these nice darker tones, whilst not lifting too much. And then once you've got enough layers in with your darker tones, you can then start to pick out a few highlights. But what you don't want to do is go in too soon with a lighter tone to try and thicken up that fur, and then it's just going to go too bright because you've got too many of these lighter hairs going on. For this area here, starting off with dark tones, so we don't want to again lighten too soon. Even though this is a brighter area, we want to build lots of that depth in there. And this fur in this section is also quite clumped like above, so we've got lots of gaps showing in between the clumps of hairs where you've got the darker tone showing through. So starting to lift with an ivory from Stabilo 105, just picking out some of these clumps here. Nice long strokes. The fur is nice and long, so we want to get lots of movement in. Again, a very fluid, light touch, not much pressure. So down under the chin here. So really bulking these in, starting to really lift this area. The more hairs you add in, obviously the better, and the thicker the fur is going to look for you. And then finishing off with a layer of my white pastel pencil. So this is my titanium white from Spilo 100. I do use the Caran d'Ache Chinese white as well, but mainly for the really bright areas. So there's not really anywhere on this bear that's so bright it's almost glowing. So I've been using my titanium white a lot, which is still bright, but it just doesn't quite pack as much as a punch than the Chinese white. So I'm just adding quite a lot underneath the chin here where there's quite a bit of light sitting. And I've just added quite a bit down the bottom right as well, a bit more than we can see in the photograph. I just want to really make the edge there stand out a little bit more, just look a bit more interesting. So a few more highlights under the chin here. And of course, a bit more into this area. So that is my preview of my full length bear tutorial, which is over on Patreon. It went live in February, so this month, but you can access it any time. It's over 6 hours in length, and it's broken up into various parts just to make it a little bit more digestible for you. And as I've said before, it comes with the reference photo outline, my artwork, and a full materials list for you. So hopefully I will see some of you over on Patreon. He is one of my favorite tutorials so far. So he's been very, very popular as well, which is amazing. It's always nice when you particularly love something and you see your patrons really enjoy it as well. So I've got a bobcat coming next, which I'll try and pull together a preview of that as well if I've got time. Otherwise, you can see him coming to life with my work in progress over on my social channels. I'll just leave you in peace to watch me finish this section off. But thank you so much for supporting me on my YouTube channel and watching my previews. It does mean a lot to me. Hopefully see some of you over on Patreon very soon. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.